What is a fraud check? The term is mainly used over in the MMA community, at least from what I've seen, but the simple definition is when a fighter who's on a streak and has a lot of hype runs into a good opponent for the first time and gets exposed. The term kind of gets overused a lot because people act like just because a good fighter loses, they got fraud checked, but it's not just that. They have to lose badly, a real poor performance that puts their biggest flaws on display. Like, I wouldn't call Lopez losing to Volk a fraud check. It was against arguably the GOAT of the division. He took it to a decision and he put up a solid fight. He just got outfought. Football teams get fraud checked all the time, every season. We constantly see teams rack up victories over lesser opposition, and then they run into a big dog and get out-meated in front of the entire world. Not talking about those games where a team gets unlucky and just misses a bunch of big chances while the other team gets one goal from one shot on target and steals the game somehow. I'm talking about a full 90 minutes of belt to ass, or a game where the much smaller team actually goes blow for blow with them and comes out on top. That's a fraud check in football. I'd also just like to point out that being fraud checked, it doesn't automatically mean you aren't good or you're not going to have any success this season. The same way not being fraud checked yet doesn't automatically mean you're not a fraud. Sometimes the team just has a really off day. Sometimes being fraud checked can actually have a positive effect too. Chelsea got waxed by Arsenal 3-0 in September 2016. It was a humiliating loss. Conte literally said it traumatized him, and it's the reason he switched to the extremely successful back three formation that ended up taking Chelsea to the title that season. This season so far has been erratic in terms of most teams' performances, and it's hard to get a good gauge of just how good a lot of the big clubs are. There's been a few question mark matches, but also a few very revealing matches, so let's bring out the tester and see whose diamonds are really dancing. I fear Barcelona has absolutely been fraud checked, and it wasn't pretty at all. You can blame it on the injuries if you want, and it's true that Barca have been utterly ravaged by them, but it's also true that teams are figuring out different ways to punch through Flick's high line, and the more time goes on, the more vulnerable it looks. Sometimes they just leave their striker way offside, and then when the first pass breaks through for a different player that's onside, the center forward becomes onside. Ramos scored the winning goal against Barca this way a couple weeks ago. Kane did it last season too, and it's a massive flaw that's hard to cover up unless you shift away from the high line. Then Sevilla absolutely mutilated the same high line just days later in a very embarrassing ass whooping that can honestly be considered the worst fraud check of the season so far. Even their last win Saturday against Girona, it could have been 3-1 or 4-1 at halftime with how much they got penetrated. Girona just didn't finish their chances. Barca barely escaped what could have been another really bad loss. They deadass had Araujo at striker at the end of the game, and low-key, why was he kind of cooking? I swear to God, if he starts actually playing there and it works, it's going to be the funniest shit of all time. I don't think that's actually going to happen, but overall, this is looking like it might end up being another one of those troll seasons for Barca like 23-24, unless something changes. They're not slipping down the table just yet, but their last performances have been awful. Losing Inigo is definitely hurting them back there. They haven't been healthy, but the injuries aren't their only major problem, and the last few weeks prove that. Unfortunately, things aren't also the prettiest for the other big dogs in town. They're not in a crisis or anything. They've only lost one game this year, but that one game also happened to be their only big game so far, and it was a straight-up spanking at the hands of an Atletico team that's looked dog shit for half the season so far. That one was definitely a pretty bad fraud check. They conceded 5. Courtois didn't look superhuman like usual. Their backline looked extremely vulnerable. Carreras was ass. Carvajal was ass and got hurt. Valverde was ass. They barely actually threatened consistently despite having 63% of the possession, and it was definitely a comeback to earth moment for a team that had reeled off 7 straight wins to start the year against generally lesser opponents. They're obviously still one of the best teams in Europe. Xabi's style and his pressing has also transformed them in a way, and with Barcelona and Atletico's situation, they're probably favorites to win La Liga, but there's questions defensively when it comes to big games, and they haven't proved under Xabi that they can be effective when they're not punching down. I don't see them as a UCL favorite, to be honest. Speaking of Atletico, I can't really say they got fraud checked because they've been kind of ass from the jump. Dropped points in their first 3 games and 5 of their first 6 in all competitions. Woke up for the Madrid game and then a week later got battered by Celta Vigo and were lucky to escape with a 1-1 draw. Looking at the Premier League, there's been a couple of frauds in the first 2 months, and the biggest was most definitely Liverpool. That run in the first month could only be the work of evil, bro. Slot was slaying goats under Anfield before every game. Extremely late winners saved them in each of their first 5 games where they generally looked unconvincing and showed a severe lack of good, consistent creation. People have desperately been trying to run the quote-unquote in transition narrative. But let's be real here. The loss of Trent is very obviously one that's going to be stinging them for a while, because there's been long stretches in numerous games where their attack looks stale and they're not actually advancing the ball anywhere. Their build-up looks ridiculous sometimes. The players don't look like they've actually been told to do anything but just go out there and hoop. I don't know what coaching Sly is doing. Not only that, their defense has been wide open for the majority of the first couple months, and I know we clown Van Dijk for clapping his cheeks instead of stepping up on that Caicedo goal and obliterating McAllister before jogging back when Mbeumo scored yesterday. But without him, I promise Liverpool will be a lot lower than second or third or whatever they are right now. It's also starting to look like the greediness was a little bit of a mistake. They didn't need both Isak and Ekitike. They probably should have addressed other squad issues instead, especially with how talented Ekitike is. He came off the bench against United and immediately looked better than Isak had for the entire first hour. There was no need to load up on strikers when you had holes in other areas. They spent almost 250 million euros on that position alone. I'm not saying Isak sucks or anything. At some point, he'll get hot and start scoring and people will go back to glazing him, but his inconsistency has always been a problem, and people ignore his long, cold spells and poor performances because of how great his hot streaks are. No, this isn't a hindsight thing either. I've been saying this for a while. Now, Isak is a player that has the potential to be an absolute offensive juggernaut, and he's been showing flashes for multiple seasons. The problem is his inconsistency and the fact that I think he could be a lot more active in Newcastle's attack. Instead of their fraud check being one bad game, it's been 4 consecutive losses. One of them against a Palmer-less Chelsea and another one against a mid-United team. Tottenham is odd to me. They pulled off an impressive win against City at the Etihad and then got utterly obliterated by Bournemouth the very next weekend. The 1-0 scoreline probably doesn't do that game justice, to be honest. Tottenham were at home and they only managed 5 shots to Bournemouth's 20. Frank has implemented a sturdy defensive structure and they're a solid team, but they're constantly dropping points. Some people think it's because they're built to play against big teams, which is why they can beat City, but they've already drawn to Brighton and Wolves in the league too and lost to Villa. The sit back and then counter gimmick doesn't always fly against small teams that are also doing the same thing, and then you're forced to actually create something against a low block or a mid block, and you realize you don't actually have the players to do that. It's the disadvantage that comes with signing a mid-table manager, I guess. They've also had a couple of injury issues too, though, so I'll give them some grace. I wouldn't say City has been fraud-checked because they started off pretty slow, losing their second and third game anyway, so Their flaws were pretty glaring off rip. United and Chelsea's losses and drop points also aren't really fraud checks to me because those are teams that were both blatantly heavily flawed from the start. Chelsea's center backs, their disappointing attack relative to what they spent. Robert Sanchez, United's pretty much everything. Their bad performances tell you the same stuff everybody already knew. Arsenal, I'd say, hasn't been fraud checked yet. And no, I'm not saying that just because I'm an Arsenal fan, bro. The only loss was to Liverpool at Anfield on an insane late free kick. They didn't get dominated. In fact, both teams just seemed hesitant to overextend themselves and actually put their foot on the other's neck, so it led to a really boring and slow big game matchup. Arsenal still has a few issues, of course, like every club, but no team has exposed those issues badly yet. The biggest problem early in the season was Arteta's cowardice against Liverpool and City, but it's kind of hard to be punished severely for that when the defense isn't allowing much of anything. Arteta seems to have learned from that based on how he lined up at St. James, and the squad has gotten so deep that we've literally gone through an injury crisis and brushed it off. Compare that to last year when players got hurt and the whole season just fell apart. Adding creators like Eze and Zubamendi helped repair the build-up issues somewhat, and now the only big issue is getting Gyökeres going and actually finishing the good chances we create. There's been numerous games this season where we massively underperformed our expected goal total, and it's given the media the chance to run the quote-unquote set-piece narrative. That 3-game run at the end of November where we have Tottenham and Bayern at home and then Stamford Bridge all within a week will be the ultimate test. If we don't get fraud checked there, I have full belief in the rest of the season, especially based on the Bayern game. PSG, I'm going to just leave them alone. They're so overly ravaged by injuries that it's not even fair to judge them, and they don't have a performance bad enough to be a fraud check anyway. I think in one of their recent games, they drew to Strasbourg or something. Honestly, there's not a lot going on in Ligue 1 that matters in the grand scheme of things regardless. Bayern is literally walking through everybody they play. We don't even have to look at them. They're having one of the most insane starts, even by their own standards, which is saying something. Keep an eye on that PSG game on November 4th, though. Bayern has beat Chelsea and Dortmund, but that'll probably be their biggest test of the season so far. Over in Italy, bro, I don't even know, bro. Getting a gauge on the hierarchy in the Serie A right now is so hard because none of these niggas can be consistent for a damn thing, bro. Napoli has some solid wins, but an unlucky loss to Torino and a disappointing loss to Milan where they had an advantage for almost half the game. Their biggest test against City, they got an early card, so it's not really fair to judge them based on that. Milan lost their first game. A month later, they get a gritty win with 10 men over the defending champions. Madrid was brilliant that game, by the way. Then they immediately followed up with a pitiful performance against Juventus in that ugly scoreless draw. Both of them should have gotten a point taken for wasting my fucking time. Juventus literally drew 5 straight games and then lost yesterday after winning their first 3. Roma has 3 losses all season, but all 3 are in games where they dominated and the other team escaped with slim 1-0 victories. 6 of their games in all competitions have ended 1-0. They've only scored 7 goals all season in the Serie A. They're still top 5, though, somehow. Inter's 2 losses were shootouts with Udinese and Juventus. They've been pretty dominant otherwise, despite the absurd amount of big chances that they're missing. There isn't really a lot of fraud checking going on over there in Italy just because everyone kind of looks a little bit fraudulent at the same time while also kind of looking like they could potentially sneak to the top. And no one's beating anyone's ass hard enough to really say, they just got straight up destroyed. They're not really contenders anymore. I don't know. I kind of like it. It's fun. People shit on the Serie A, but it's easily been the league with the most different possible winners each year in the last half decade or so. You go into each season with about 6 actual contenders. Which teams do you think are fraudulent? Which ones do you think are the real deal? Who do you think is a dark horse in any of these leagues? Let me know in the comments. I'm going to catch y'all soon.